Settle in for tonight's story about a boy who became America's most decorated soldier, but never wanted to talk about the day that made him famous. Dim the lights, close your eyes, and let this quiet tale of courage and silence carry you to sleep. Some stories begin with grand declarations, with destiny calling from mountaintops or fate whispering through ancient halls. This one begins with a skinny kid picking cotton in the Texas heat, wondering if there was more to life than sunrise chores and sunset exhaustion. Audie Leon Murphy stood barely 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. In 1940s Texas, that made him the kind of boy who got picked last for everything except church choir and helping mama with the smaller children. His hands were soft from never knowing real work, his face unmarked by the sun that had weathered his father into leather and dust, but something flickered behind those quiet eyes. Something that wouldn't stay buried under cotton fields and Sunday sermons. The Murphy farm sat on the edge of Kingston, Texas, where the land stretched flat and endless toward horizons that promised nothing but more of the same. Audie's father had inherited the place from his father, who'd inherited it from his, each generation passing down the same cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, surviving. Young Audie would sit on the porch after supper, listening to the older men talk about places beyond the cotton fields. They'd mention cities with names like Dallas and Houston, speak of jobs in factories and offices, of lives where a man's worth wasn't measured in bales per acre. "Boy's got dreams too big for his britches," his father would mutter, not unkindly, but with the resigned tone of a man who'd learned that dreams were luxuries poor families couldn't afford. The kid didn't argue. He'd just nod and help clear the table, wash the dishes alongside his mother and sisters, then slip outside to stare at stars that seemed close enough to touch but impossibly far from anything he'd ever known. He had no idea that within 3 years, those same hands washing supper dishes would be holding a machine gun on top of a burning tank in France, fighting off an entire German company. School was Audie's escape, though he'd never admit it. Not because he loved books or learning, but because it was the one place where being small didn't automatically make you invisible. He had a quick mind, the kind that absorbed facts and figures without trying, that could solve problems others struggled with, his teachers noticed. Mrs. Henderson, who taught 8th grade, would keep him after class sometimes, not for punishment but to talk about things beyond the usual curriculum. History, geography, literature. She'd speak of wars and faraway places, of young men who'd left small towns to serve their country. "You've got potential, Audie," she'd say, her voice carrying the careful hope of a teacher who'd seen too many bright students disappear into the same cycles that had claimed their parents. "Don't let it go to waste." He'd promise he wouldn't, meaning it in that moment, then walk home past the cotton fields that seemed to stretch wider every day, mocking his small-town dreams with their endless, repetitive rows. What Mrs. Henderson couldn't know was that she was looking at a boy who would one day stand alone against impossible odds, who would become the living embodiment of everything she hoped her students could achieve. The Murphy family struggled. Not dramatically, not in ways that made neighbors whisper or churches organize charity drives, but in the quiet, grinding way that wore people down season after season. There was always just enough food, just enough money for necessities, just enough hope to keep going but never enough to get ahead. Audie's mother worked as hard as his father, maybe harder. She kept house, tended children, helped in the fields when harvest demanded every available hand. She never complained, at least not where the children could hear, but sometimes Audie would catch her staring out the kitchen window with an expression he couldn't quite read, yearning, maybe, or resignation. The look of a woman who'd once had different dreams. His siblings were good kids, each finding their own way to cope with the limitations of their circumstances. His older brother talked about joining the military, seeing the world, learning a trade that didn't involve dirt under his fingernails. His younger sisters dreamed of city lives, of jobs in department stores or offices, of husbands who wore suits instead of overalls. But none of them carried the particular combination of quiet intensity and stubborn determination that set Audie apart. None of them had that spark that would one day refuse to be extinguished even when death was calling from all directions. When Pearl Harbor happened, everything changed. Not immediately, not in obvious ways, but like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples eventually reached even the remotest corners of Texas farm country. Audie was 17, still small for his age, still helping with chores and dreaming of somewhere else. But suddenly those dreams had a shape, a direction, a purpose that made sense to everyone around him. The war wasn't just something happening to other people in distant places. It was coming for young American men, calling them to serve, offering them the chance to be part of something larger than cotton fields and small-town limitations. He couldn't have known that answering that call would lead him to a day in France so terrible, so overwhelming, that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to forget it ever happened. The Army recruiting station in Greenville, Texas, wasn't much to look at. A small office wedged between a hardware store and a diner, with government-issue furniture and a staff sergeant who'd seen enough eager young men to know the difference between those who'd make it and those who'd wash out before basic training ended. Audie Murphy walked through the door in June 1942, looking even younger than his 18 years, carrying himself with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself seem bigger than he actually was. The sergeant looked him up and down with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent years sorting boys from men. What he saw wasn't encouraging. Height, 5 feet 5 inches. Weight, 112 pounds. No military experience. No technical training. No obvious physical advantages that would make him valuable to an army preparing for global war. "Son," the sergeant said, his voice not unkind but matter-of-fact, "you sure you're in the right place? Navy might be more your speed. Or maybe wait a year, put some meat on those bones." Audie's response would have surprised anyone who knew the quiet farm boy. His jaw set with a determination that seemed too large for his slight frame, and his voice carried a conviction that cut through the stuffy office air like a blade. "I want to serve, Sergeant. I want to fight." The words hung in the air between them. The sergeant had heard similar declarations from hundreds of young men, most of whom had no idea what they were asking for. But something in Audie's tone, some quality in his eyes, made the older man pause and look again. Still, regulations were regulations. Weight requirements existed for good reasons. The military wasn't in the business of sending boys to do men's work, especially when that work involved carrying heavy equipment across hostile territory while people shot at you. "Come back when you've gained 20 pounds, the sergeant said, stamping rejected across Audie's application papers. "Uncle Sam needs soldiers, not scarecrows." What happened next would become family legend, though Audie himself would never talk about it. Not the rejection, not what he did afterward, and certainly not what it revealed about the kind of man he was becoming. For 6 months, Audie worked. Not just the usual farm chores and cotton field labor, but a deliberate campaign to reshape his body into something the army might accept. He ate everything his mother put in front of him and then some. He lifted hay bales until his arms shook. He ran country roads until his lungs burned and his legs wobbled. Most importantly, he prepared his mind for what he knew was coming. He read every military manual he could find, studied maps of Europe and the Pacific, followed war news with the intensity of someone whose future depended on understanding how modern warfare actually worked. His family watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and concern. Pride because their quiet boy was showing a determination and focus they'd never seen before. Concern because that same determination carried an edge, a hardness that made them wonder what kind of war he was preparing to fight. They couldn't know that their son was unconsciously training for a moment that would come 3 years later, when everything he'd learned about himself and warfare would be tested in ways no training manual could possibly prepare him for. When Audie returned to the recruiting station in January 1943, the same staff sergeant was behind the same desk, processing the same endless stream of young men eager to serve their country. But this time, when the farm boy from Kingston stepped forward, something was different, not just the additional 15 pounds he'd managed to gain, though that certainly helped. Not just the confident way he carried himself, though the sergeant noticed that too. It was something in his eyes, a quality that suggested this wasn't just another kid playing soldier. The medical exam revealed what 6 months of determined effort could accomplish. Audie now met minimum weight requirements. His vision was excellent. His reflexes were quick. His overall physical condition was better than average. More importantly, the psychological evaluation suggested something the examining officer couldn't quite put his finger on. Intelligence, obviously. determination, certainly. But also a kind of focused intensity that seemed unusual in someone so young. "Were you hoping to serve, Murphy?" the recruiting officer asked, pen poised over assignment papers. Audie's answer came without hesitation, delivered in the same quiet tone that had marked his entire application process. But the words themselves carried a weight that would prove prophetic. "Wherever the fighting is heaviest, sir. I didn't come this far to sit in some office." The officer made a note on the file. "Infantry. European theater. Immediate deployment upon completion of basic training." What none of them could know was that they'd just processed the application of someone who would become the most decorated American soldier in history. Someone whose actions in combat would become the stuff of legend, but also someone who would spend the rest of his life wishing he'd never been quite so eager to find out what real fighting looked like. Camp Walters, Texas, in early 1943 was where the United States Army turned civilian boys into infantry soldiers. It was a harsh, efficient process designed to break down individual identity and rebuild it into something that could function as part of a military unit under the worst possible conditions. For most recruits, basic training was a shock. The sudden immersion into military discipline, the physical demands, the constant pressure from drill sergeants who seemed to view new soldiers as barely human obstacles to be shaped through systematic application of stress and exhaustion. Audie Murphy took to it like he'd been born for it, not because it was easy. Nothing about military training was easy, but because something in his makeup responded to the clarity of military life. Clear rules. Clear expectations. Clear consequences for failure to meet standards. His drill instructors noticed him almost immediately. Not because he stood out physically, he remained one of the smallest men in his unit, but because of the way he approached every task with methodical intensity. Rifle training. Audie absorbed weapon maintenance and marksmanship instruction with the focus of someone who understood that his life might depend on getting these details right. While other recruits treated cleaning their M1 Garens as tedious busy work, Audie approached it as a kind of meditation, physical conditioning. Despite his size disadvantage, he pushed himself through every exercise, every march, every endurance test with a determination that impressed even veteran non-commissioned officers who'd seen thousands of recruits come and go. Tactical training. When instructors demonstrated infantry tactics, how to move under fire, how to coordinate with other soldiers, how to make split-second decisions under pressure, Audie didn't just listen. He internalized, analyzing every scenario, every possibility, every potential variation. His fellow recruits began to notice something unusual about the quiet kid from Texas. During training exercises, when situations became chaotic and confusing, Audie seemed to process information differently than others. Faster. More completely. It was as if he possessed some kind of internal combat computer that could analyze threats, calculate responses, and execute decisions while others were still trying to understand what was happening. The transformation wasn't just physical or tactical. Something deeper was changing in Audie Murphy, something his family back in Texas wouldn't have recognized. The gentle farm boy was developing an edge, a hardness that came from understanding that warfare was ultimately about one simple principle: kill or be killed. His instructors began using him as an example for other recruits. Not in obvious ways, they were too professional to play favorites, but in the subtle manner of experienced teachers highlighting excellence when they saw it. "Murphy," they'd say during weapons demonstrations, "show these other knuckleheads how to field strip this rifle properly." Or during tactical exercises, Murphy's squad just demonstrated how to advance under fire without getting everyone killed. The rest of you might want to pay attention. What they couldn't know was that they were watching the early development of someone who would one day demonstrate tactical abilities that would become legendary throughout the entire United States military. The letters Audie wrote home during this period revealed little of what was really happening to him. He wrote about the weather, about his fellow soldiers, about missing his mother's cooking. He didn't write about the way military training was reshaping not just his body but his entire way of thinking about the world. He didn't write about the growing realization that he possessed natural abilities that seemed almost supernatural in combat situations. Enhanced situational awareness. Lightning-fast reflexes. An intuitive understanding of how battles developed and flowed. Most importantly, he didn't write about the gradual emotional numbing that was necessary preparation for what lay ahead. The process by which a gentle Texas farm boy slowly learned to think of other human beings as targets, as obstacles, as problems to be solved through application of superior firepower and tactics. His mother would have wept if she'd understood what the Army was doing to her quiet, sensitive son. His father might have been proud. Neither would have recognized the soldier who emerged from basic training in the summer of 1943. When Audie Murphy graduated from infantry training, his instructors marked his file with the kind of notations that followed soldiers through their entire military careers. Natural leadership ability. Exceptional marksmanship. Recommended for advanced combat roles. What they were really noting, though they might not have had words for it, was the presence of that rare combination of intelligence, physical capability, and emotional control that produced truly effective combat soldiers. The Army had plans for Private Murphy. Assignment to a frontline infantry unit. Immediate deployment to the European theater. Placement in situations where his developing skills would be tested against the best the German military could offer. They had no idea they were sending someone to France who would one day stand alone on top of a burning tank, fighting off an entire enemy company while the world seemed to be ending around him. The transport ship USS General George M. Randall wasn't built for comfort. Designed to move large numbers of soldiers across vast oceanic distances as quickly and efficiently as possible, it packed men into every available space with the kind of industrial efficiency that treated human beings as cargo to be delivered. Audie Murphy found himself assigned to a berth deep in the ship's belly, surrounded by hundreds of other soldiers making the same journey toward an uncertain future in European combat zones. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, nervous conversation, and the underlying tension that came from knowing they were heading toward something none of them fully understood. Most of the men aboard were experiencing their first ocean voyage. Many had never been more than 100 miles from their hometowns. The vastness of the Atlantic, the endless expanse of gray water stretching to every horizon, was overwhelming in ways they hadn't anticipated. But for Audie, the ocean crossing became a time of internal preparation, a chance to observe and learn from the hundreds of other soldiers who would soon be facing the same challenges he faced. He spent hours walking the ship's decks, when weather permitted, studying his fellow passengers. Infantry soldiers from a dozen different states, each carrying their own fears and hopes and misconceptions about what lay ahead. Tank crews heading to armored divisions. Artillery specialists bound for gun batteries. Support personnel who would keep the entire military machine functioning. What struck him most was how young they all were. Boys, really, most of them barely old enough to vote, heading off to participate in the largest military conflict in human history. Many had never been away from home for more than a few days. Now they were crossing an ocean to fight enemies they'd only heard about in radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines. The conversations he overheard revealed the full spectrum of human response to impending combat. Some men talked constantly, as if words could somehow prepare them for what was coming. Others fell into silent contemplation, writing long letters to families they might never see again. Audie found himself somewhere in between. Not silent, but selective about when and with whom he spoke. Already developing the kind of careful assessment of people and situations that would serve him well in combat environments. He made friends, but carefully. The kind of provisional friendships that soldiers form when they know their time together might be measured in weeks rather than years. Men who shared his bunk area, who stood with him in chow lines, who played cards during the long hours when there was nothing to do but wait. Most of them were larger than Audie, both physically and in terms of personality. Loud, confident young men who talked about the war as if it were some kind of extended sporting event where American superiority would quickly assert itself over inferior opponents. Audie listened to these conversations without contributing much. Something in his makeup, some combination of natural caution and growing tactical awareness, suggested that overconfidence might be the most dangerous enemy they'd faced. He was already beginning to understand something that wouldn't become clear to his shipmates until much later. Warfare was a contest between human beings willing to kill each other, and the side that approached it most seriously usually won. The ship's library was small but well stocked with military manuals, tactical guides, and historical accounts of previous conflicts. While other soldiers spent their free time playing poker or writing letters, Audie found himself reading everything he could find about modern warfare, infantry tactics, weapon systems, combat psychology, historical analysis of successful and unsuccessful military campaigns. He absorbed information with the same methodical intensity he'd brought to basic training, as if building a mental database that might prove crucial when academic knowledge met battlefield reality. His reading wasn't just technical. He also studied accounts written by soldiers who'd actually experienced combat, looking for insights about how men behaved under extreme stress, how units functioned when everything went wrong, how individuals survived when survival seemed impossible. What he was really doing, though he might not have realized it consciously, was preparing mentally for situations that would test every aspect of his character, his training, and his will to live. The weather across the Atlantic in late 1943 was rough. Storm systems that turned the ocean into a chaos of 30-foot waves and howling winds. Most of the soldiers aboard spent days seasick, huddled in their berths, too miserable to eat or think about anything except surviving the next hour. Audie seemed immune to seasickness. While others struggled with basic functions, he maintained his routines. Reading, writing, observing, preparing. His shipmates began to notice this unusual stability. In conditions that reduced most men to helpless misery, the small Texas farm boy remained calm, functional, almost unnaturally composed. Murphy, one of his bunkmates, said during a particularly brutal storm, "You're either the toughest son of a bitch on this ship, or you're too stupid to be scared." Audie's response revealed something that would become characteristic of how he handled stress throughout his military service. A quiet smile, a casual shrug, and words that gave away nothing about what was really going on inside his head. "Maybe a little of both," he said, then returned to the tactical manual he'd been reading. What he didn't say, what he was just beginning to understand about himself, was that extreme situations didn't make him panic. They made him more focused, more capable, more alive. The ship docked at Casablanca in French Morocco on February 14, 1944. Valentine's Day, though none of the soldiers disembarking were thinking about romance. They were thinking about heat, dust, unfamiliar smells, and the strange reality of being in a combat zone for the first time. Audie Murphy stepped off that transport ship as Private Murphy of the 15th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division. A small-town Texas boy who'd successfully completed the journey from civilian to soldier. What he couldn't know was that he was about to begin a series of combat experiences that would test every aspect of his preparation, his character, and his will to survive in ways that no training could possibly anticipate. The reality of combat hit Audie Murphy like a physical blow the first time he heard incoming artillery fire. Not the controlled demonstrations from training, not the theoretical discussions about modern warfare he'd read about, but the actual sound of enemy shells seeking to kill him and everyone around him. It was Sicily, July 1943, and the 3rd Infantry Division was part of the Allied invasion force fighting to establish footholds on European soil. The island was supposed to fall quickly, according to the briefings. German and Italian forces were supposed to offer limited resistance before withdrawing to more defensible positions, but nobody had told the enemy about Allied expectations, and the first lesson Audie learned about real warfare was that everything you thought you knew was probably wrong. The landing beaches were chaos. Equipment scattered across sand that churned under the impact of mortar rounds. Officers shouting orders that no one could hear over the noise of exploding shells and automatic weapon fire. Men who'd been confident during the voyage across the Mediterranean suddenly discovering that confident talk meant nothing when people were shooting at you. Audie found himself moving forward with his squad, not because he was particularly brave, but because forward was the only direction that made tactical sense. Staying on the beach meant staying in a killing zone. Moving inland meant finding cover, establishing defensive positions, beginning the methodical process of defeating enemies who clearly had no intention of making things easy. His first confirmed kill happened almost by accident. German sniper in a church tower, systematically picking off American soldiers as they advanced through a small coastal village. Audie saw the muzzle flash, calculated angle and distance, adjusted for wind, and fired a single shot that ended the threat. The enemy sniper fell backward into the tower, dead before he hit the floor. Audie felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, no dramatic emotional response. Just the practical realization that one threat had been eliminated and others remained. His squad leader, Sergeant Brady, witnessed the shot from 50 yards away. Later, during a brief lull in fighting, he approached Audie with an expression that mixed surprise and approval. "That was some shooting, Murphy. 500 yards, moving target, one shot. Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Audie's response was characteristic, matter-of-fact, revealing nothing about how the moment had affected him internally. "Grew up hunting, Sergeant. Same principles." What he didn't say was that killing a human being felt exactly like hunting. The same careful calculation of variables. The same patient waiting for the right moment. The same mechanical precision of trigger squeeze and follow-through. The only difference was that this particular target had been trying to kill American soldiers, which made the mathematics of the situation much simpler. As the Sicily campaign progressed, Audie's reputation began to develop. Not just for marksmanship, though his ability with a rifle quickly became legendary within his unit. More importantly, for his ability to function effectively when situations became chaotic and overwhelming. Combat, he discovered, was mostly chaos. Plans that disintegrated upon contact with reality. Communications that failed at crucial moments. Leaders who made mistakes or got killed at inconvenient times. Equipment that malfunctioned when you needed it most. Other soldiers seemed paralyzed by this chaos, unable to function when their training scenarios met battlefield unpredictability. Audie found chaos clarifying. When everything was falling apart, when normal social rules no longer applied, when survival depended on making correct decisions under impossible pressure, something in his makeup responded with enhanced capability. It was as if combat conditions unlocked aspects of his personality that had remained dormant during peacetime. Speed of thought. Tactical intuition. Emotional control that bordered on the supernatural. The Italian campaign that followed Sicily was where Audie Murphy began his transformation from competent soldier to something approaching military legend. The terrain was brutal: mountains, river crossings, fortified positions that had to be taken one bloody yard at a time. German forces, far from the demoralized remnants Allied intelligence had predicted, fought with professional competence and absolute determination. They knew the ground, had prepared defensive positions for months, and possessed equipment and training that made them formidable opponents. Audie's unit was assigned to a series of river crossings, each more difficult than the last. The Volturno River. The Rapido River. Natural obstacles that German engineers had turned into killing zones through careful placement of machine gun nests, artillery observers, and prepared positions that commanded every possible approach route. During the Rapido River crossing in January 1944, Audie Murphy experienced combat at its most elemental, a struggle between human beings who had decided that only one side could survive the encounter. The crossing was supposed to happen at night, under cover of darkness, with engineering support to help infantry units establish bridgeheads on the far side. What actually happened was a disaster that cost the 36th Infantry Division nearly 2,000 casualties in less than 48 hours. Audie's company was among the first to attempt the crossing. They loaded into assault boats under heavy fire, struggled across water that seemed impossibly wide, and found themselves on the far shore with no clear objectives except survival. German artillery had the entire area pre-registered. Enemy machine gun positions commanded every piece of cover. Mortar teams dropped rounds with precision that suggested they'd been practicing for exactly this scenario. Most of the company was killed or wounded within the first 2 hours. Audie found himself with 3 other survivors in a shell crater 50 yards from the river, cut off from retreat, unable to advance, waiting for darkness or death, whichever came first. That's when he discovered something about himself that would define the rest of his military service. He was most effective when situations seemed hopeless. Using a combination of battlefield improvisation and tactical instincts that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his training, Audie organized the 3 survivors into an effective fighting unit. They began systematically eliminating German positions, using captured weapons, moving under cover of their own artillery, advancing by fire and maneuver. By dawn, they had cleared a section of the German line and established a small bridgehead that allowed follow-up forces to cross the river successfully. For men had accomplished what an entire company had failed to do 12 hours earlier, but the cost of that success was something Audi would carry for the rest of his life, the knowledge that he was capable of things most human beings could never imagine, and that this capability came with a price he was only beginning to understand. When the battle finally ended and casualties were counted, Audi Murphy had been awarded his first medal for valor. His commanding officers had marked his file with notations that would follow him through the remainder of his military service. What they couldn't note in any official record was that the quiet farm boy from Texas was developing into something unprecedented, a soldier whose combat abilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. And that the experiences creating these abilities were also creating psychological wounds that would never fully heal. By early 1944, Audi Murphy was no longer the uncertain farm boy who'd struggled to meet Army weight requirements. Combat in Sicily and Italy had transformed him into something his family back in Texas wouldn't have recognized, a professional killer whose abilities bordered on the supernatural. His service record told part of the story. Multiple decorations for valor. Promotion to corporal, then sergeant. Assignment to increasingly dangerous missions that required precisely the kind of tactical instincts and emotional control he demonstrated repeatedly under fire, but service records couldn't capture what combat had actually done to the young men from Kingston, Texas. The psychological changes that were creating America's most decorated soldier were also creating someone who would struggle for the rest of his life with what he'd become. The 3rd Infantry Division was pulled out of Italy in early 1944 to prepare for Operation Dragoon, the planned invasion of southern France. After months of continuous combat, the division needed rest, replacement soldiers, new equipment, and retraining for amphibious operations. Audi spent this interlude in Naples, billeted with other non-commissioned officers in a partially destroyed hotel that the Army had converted into temporary barracks. For the first time in months, he had opportunity to think about something other than immediate survival. What he discovered was that peace was more difficult than combat. When he wasn't fighting, when there were no immediate tactical problems to solve, when survival didn't depend on constant vigilance, his mind began processing experiences he'd been too busy to fully understand. The faces of men he'd killed began visiting him in dreams. Not dramatic nightmares, but quiet, persistent images that appeared whenever he closed his eyes. German soldiers who'd been sons, fathers, brothers to people who would never see them again. He started writing letters home, but found himself unable to explain what he'd experienced. How could he describe to his mother the way human bodies looked after artillery strikes? How could he tell his father about the satisfaction he'd felt when his tactical decisions resulted in enemy casualties? Instead, he wrote about the weather, about food, about missing Texas. He wrote about his fellow soldiers, most of whom were dead or wounded or transferred to other units. He wrote about everything except what was actually happening to him internally. His reputation within the division was growing. Other soldiers sought him out for advice about combat tactics, weapon maintenance, survival techniques. Officers who were supposed to be his superiors found themselves deferring to his judgment in situations that required experience he possessed and they lacked, but reputation came with isolation. Men who recognized his abilities also recognized something else. Audi Murphy was becoming someone who existed primarily for warfare, who functioned most effectively when other people's lives depended on his decisions. The training for Operation Dragoon was intensive. Amphibious assault techniques. Urban warfare. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery units. Integration with French resistance forces who would provide local intelligence and support. Audi absorbed this training with the same methodical intensity he brought to everything since basic training. But now his approach was informed by actual combat experience, by knowledge of what worked and what got people killed. He began developing tactical innovations that impressed his instructors. Methods for clearing buildings that minimized casualties among attacking forces. Techniques for coordinating small unit actions that maximized effectiveness against prepared defensive positions. More importantly, he began training other soldiers, passing on hard-won knowledge that might keep them alive when academic theory met battlefield reality. What he was really doing was transforming from a soldier who fought effectively into a soldier who could teach others how to fight effectively. the difference would prove crucial in the months ahead. The invasion of southern France began on August 15, 1944. Unlike the Sicily landings, this operation proceeded almost exactly according to plan. German resistance was lighter than expected. Allied forces established beachheads quickly and began advancing inland against minimal opposition. For most of the assault force, the landings represented successful execution of complex military planning. For Audie Murphy, they represented return to an environment where his abilities had meaning and purpose. Within hours of reaching French soil, he was back in his element, making tactical decisions under pressure, leading men in combat, functioning as the kind of soldier the army had spent 2 years training him to become. The advance through southern France was rapid. German forces, recognizing that their positions were untenable, conducted a series of fighting withdrawals designed to delay Allied progress while avoiding decisive engagement. This type of warfare suited Audie perfectly. Fast-moving operations that required flexibility, initiative, and the ability to exploit enemy mistakes before they could be corrected. He thrived in situations that demanded split-second decisions and immediate action. His unit was assigned to pursue retreating German forces through the Vosges Mountains, terrain that favored defenders and made every advance costly. But Audie had learned to read landscapes like tactical manuals, understanding how geography influenced combat options. He began anticipating enemy actions with uncanny accuracy, positioning his men to exploit defensive weaknesses before those weaknesses became apparent to anyone else. By October 1944, Audie Murphy held the rank of second lieutenant and commanded a platoon of soldiers who regarded him with the kind of respect usually reserved for much older, more experienced officers. What they were really respecting was his ability to keep them alive in situations where survival seemed unlikely. His tactical decisions consistently produced success with minimal casualties among his own men, but they were also beginning to recognize something else about their young commander. He was becoming someone who existed primarily for combat, who seemed most alive when death was closest. The winter of 1944-45 in France was brutal. Not just because of weather, though the cold was severe enough to cause frostbite casualties among troops not equipped for extended winter operations. More significantly because German resistance was stiffening as Allied forces approached the German border. Enemy units that had been conducting fighting withdrawals for months were now preparing to defend positions they considered vital to German security. The easy advances through southern France were ending, replaced by the kind of methodical, costly warfare that characterized the final months of the European conflict. For Audie Murphy, this transition represented the ultimate test of everything he'd learned about himself and warfare during 2 years of continuous combat. The approaching battles would determine whether his abilities were sufficient for the most challenging situations human beings could create. The morning of January 26, 1945, began like most mornings during the Vosges Mountains campaign, cold, gray, and filled with the kind of routine uncertainty that characterized infantry operations near the German border. Audie Murphy's platoon was positioned outside the village of Holzwihr, France, part of a broader Allied effort to clear German forces from the Colmar pocket. But within hours, this ordinary winter morning would produce the most extraordinary combat action in United States military history, and burden a young Texas farm boy with memories he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The tactical situation seemed straightforward. German forces were conducting a fighting withdrawal, using prepared positions to delay Allied advance while avoiding decisive engagement. Standard operating procedure called for methodical reduction of enemy strongpoints, coordinated artillery support, and careful advance by fire and maneuver. Audie's company had been assigned to clear a section of woodland that intelligence reports suggested contained minimal enemy presence. A routine patrol mission that should have been completed by midday with minimal contact. What intelligence reports hadn't revealed was that the Germans had reinforced this position during the night with elements of 2 different divisions, supported by armor, and were preparing to launch a counterattack designed to recapture territory lost during previous weeks. The first indication that something was wrong came at approximately 0900 hours, when Audie's lead scout reported movement in the tree line ahead of their position. Not the scattered individuals or small groups that characterized retreating forces, but organized units moving with the kind of tactical precision that suggested preparation for offensive operations. Audie immediately halted his platoon's advance and began conducting a more detailed reconnaissance of the area. What he discovered was a German force of approximately company strength, supported by at least 2 tanks, positioned to strike at Allied forces that were advancing according to predetermined schedules. His tactical assessment was immediate and accurate. His 40-man platoon was about to be attacked by a force 3 times larger, better equipped, and occupying prepared defensive positions. Standard military doctrine in such situations called for immediate withdrawal and coordination with higher headquarters for artillery support and reinforcement. But standard doctrine assumed communication systems would function properly, that supporting units would be available, and that withdrawal routes would remain open. None of those assumptions proved accurate on January 26, 1945. Radio communications with company headquarters had been intermittent all morning due to atmospheric conditions and German jamming efforts. The nearest Allied units were committed to their own tactical situations and unavailable for immediate support. Most critically, German forces had positioned themselves to cut off probable withdrawal routes. Audie Murphy found himself in exactly the kind of situation that had occurred repeatedly during his combat service: isolated, outnumbered, facing impossible odds, and responsible for the lives of men who were depending on him to make the right decisions. His response was characteristic. No panic. No waste motion. No dramatic speeches or heroic gestures. Just methodical analysis of available options and selection of the course of action most likely to result in mission accomplishment with minimum casualties among his own forces. He positioned his platoon in a hasty defensive perimeter that took advantage of available cover and concealment. He established fields of fire that would channel attacking forces into areas where his men's weapons would be most effective. He prepared fallback positions that could be occupied if initial positions became untenable. Most importantly, he began making the kind of tactical calculations that separated competent soldiers from legends, analyzing enemy capabilities, anticipating their likely courses of action, and identifying opportunities to turn defensive disadvantages into offensive opportunities. The German attack began at 1030 hours with a coordinated artillery barrage that indicated professional competence and serious intent. This wasn't harassment fire or probing action. This was preparation for assault operations designed to overrun Allied positions and inflict maximum casualties. Audie's men had never experienced artillery fire of this intensity. Shells that seemed to fall with mathematical precision, creating interlocking zones of destruction that made movement above ground impossible. Concussion waves that ruptured eardrums and induced temporary paralysis. Shrapnel patterns that turned everyday objects into deadly projectiles, but they had been trained by someone who understood that survival under artillery fire depended on discipline, proper use of available cover, and refusal to allow fear to interfere with tactical thinking. As the barrage lifted and German infantry began their assault, Audie moved among his positions, ensuring that his men were ready, that weapons were functioning properly, that each soldier understood his role in the defensive plan they were about to execute. What happened next would be recorded in dozens of official reports, witness statements, and historical analyses. But none of those documents could capture what it felt like to be in the middle of a combat action where individual decisions had immediate life and death consequences. The fighting that followed was unlike anything Audie had experienced during 2 years of continuous combat. Not because it was more intense than previous battles, but because it demanded every aspect of his abilities simultaneously: tactical judgment, marksmanship, leadership, and the kind of emotional control that allowed rational thought under impossible pressure. The German assault developed exactly as Audie Murphy had predicted. Infantry advancing in small groups, using cover and concealment effectively, supported by automatic weapons fire and coordinated with armor that remained just outside the effective range of Allied anti-tank weapons, professional soldiers executing a well-planned attack against positions they had studied and understood. Under normal circumstances, against a typical infantry platoon, the attack should have succeeded within 30 minutes, but these weren't normal circumstances, and Audie Murphy's platoon wasn't typical in ways the German commanders couldn't have anticipated. The first wave of attackers encountered defensive fire that was more accurate, more coordinated, and more effective than they had expected. Instead of panic and confusion typical of units under severe pressure, they faced soldiers who had been trained to function as individual weapon systems integrated into a comprehensive defensive scheme. Audie had positioned his men to create interlocking fields of fire that forced attacking forces to expose themselves to multiple threats simultaneously. German soldiers who sought cover from one weapon position found themselves targeted by others. Small unit tactics that worked against average defenders proved ineffective against this particular defensive arrangement. More significantly, the German attack encountered something unprecedented in their combat experience: a single individual whose tactical abilities seemed to transcend normal human limitations. Audi was everywhere simultaneously. Directing fire, adjusting defensive positions, moving wounded soldiers to safety, coordinating with what remained of his communications equipment, making the kind of instantaneous decisions that kept his defensive plan functioning as enemy pressure increased. But individual excellence, no matter how extraordinary, couldn't compensate for the mathematics of the tactical situation. 40 Allied soldiers, regardless of their training and leadership, couldn't indefinitely withstand attack by a force 3 times larger with superior equipment and prepared support. By 1,200 hours, despite inflicting heavy casualties on attacking forces, Audi's platoon was in serious trouble. Ammunition was running low. Several weapon positions had been overrun. Communication with higher headquarters remained impossible. Medical supplies were exhausted. Most critically, German forces had identified weaknesses in the defensive perimeter and were concentrating their attacks on positions that couldn't be adequately reinforced. Under these conditions, military doctrine was clear: conduct fighting withdrawal to more defensible positions, preserve remaining personnel for future operations, avoid decisive engagement under unfavorable circumstances. But Audi Murphy had learned something during 2 years of combat that wasn't taught in any military manual. Sometimes situations developed where doctrine became irrelevant, where success depended entirely on individual will to achieve impossible objectives. The decision he made at that moment would define the rest of his life and become the foundation for his historical reputation. Instead of ordering withdrawal, instead of attempting to preserve his remaining men for future battles, he chose to continue fighting, not because he expected to win. The tactical situation made victory impossible through conventional means, but because he recognized an opportunity to accomplish something that might justify the casualties his men had already suffered. If he could hold German forces in place for another few hours, if he could prevent their attack from achieving its objectives, other Allied units might have time to reinforce threatened positions or launch counterattacks that would restore tactical balance. The critical moment came when German armor finally moved within range of his positions. 2 tanks, supported by approximately 60 infantry soldiers, beginning a coordinated assault that would sweep away remaining resistance within minutes. Audi's anti-tank weapons had been destroyed during earlier fighting. His communications equipment was non-functional. Most of his men were dead, wounded, or had expended their ammunition. By every reasonable military standard, continued resistance was pointless. That's when he climbed onto the burning tank destroyer. The M36 Slugger had taken a direct hit from German artillery 30 minutes earlier. Its crew was dead. Its ammunition was exploding intermittently due to internal fires. Its fuel tank was ruptured and leaking gasoline that created an expanding pool of potential catastrophe. Any rational person would have avoided the vehicle entirely. Any trained soldier would have recognized it as a death trap waiting to explode. Any sane human being would have found cover elsewhere. Audi Murphy used it as his final fighting position. From the commander's cupola of the burning tank destroyer, using its .50 caliber machine gun, he began engaging German forces with sustained, accurate fire that stopped their attack completely, not because his individual weapon could inflict decisive casualties on forces of that size, but because his position was psychologically devastating to soldiers who had been trained to expect rational behavior from their opponents. The sight of a single American soldier, standing upright on a burning vehicle, calmly operating a machine gun while surrounded by enemies who were trying to kill him, was so far beyond normal combat experience that it induced a kind of tactical paralysis among German forces. For the next hour, Audi Murphy fought alone. Enemy soldiers who tried to approach his position were killed or wounded. Enemy automatic weapons that targeted him were suppressed by return fire that was more accurate than anything they had encountered. Enemy artillery that attempted to destroy his position was frustrated by his ability to shift locations on the vehicle while maintaining effective fire. What was happening transcended normal definitions of combat. This was no longer tactical engagement between military units. This had become something approaching mythology, a single human being refusing to accept defeat under circumstances that made defeat inevitable. The German attack, which should have succeeded easily, ground to a halt. Officers who had planned the operation found themselves dealing with a situation for which they had no training, no doctrine, no previous experience. How do you defeat someone who appears immune to fear, who functions effectively under conditions that would incapacitate normal soldiers, who continues fighting when continued fighting appears suicidal? The answer, it turned out, was that you didn't defeat him. You waited for him to run out of ammunition, or for the vehicle he was using as a fighting position to finally explode, or for Allied reinforcements to arrive and change the tactical situation. What actually happened was that Audie Murphy held his position until his ammunition was exhausted, then organized the withdrawal of his surviving men to safety, having inflicted casualties that made continued German offensive operations impossible. The battle that was supposed to result in Allied defeat had become a German tactical disaster, prevented by the actions of a single individual who refused to accept that some situations were hopeless. When the fighting finally ended on January 26, 1945, Audie Murphy had accomplished something unprecedented in United States military history. His actions during the Battle of the Colmar Pocket would be studied by military historians for decades, analyzed as an example of how individual excellence could influence tactical outcomes under extreme circumstances, but historical significance was the furthest thing from his mind as he helped evacuate wounded soldiers and counted the cost of what had happened during those terrible hours. Of the 40 men in his platoon that morning, 14 were dead. 16 were wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation. The remaining 10, including Audie himself, were physically functional but psychologically marked by experiences that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The German forces they had engaged suffered casualties that effectively ended their ability to conduct offensive operations in that sector. Approximately 240 enemy soldiers were killed or wounded. 2 tanks were destroyed. Most importantly, the attack that was supposed to recapture several miles of territory had been stopped completely. From a tactical perspective, the engagement was an overwhelming Allied success. From a human perspective, it was the kind of victory that felt indistinguishable from defeat. Audie's first concern was his surviving men. Soldiers who had trusted his leadership, followed his orders, and paid prices he hadn't anticipated when he decided to continue fighting. Men whose lives had been forever altered by decisions he had made under pressure. He moved among them, checking wounds, offering water, providing the kind of immediate care that was possible with limited medical supplies. But he could see in their eyes something that disturbed him more than physical injuries, the look of men who had witnessed things beyond normal human experience. They had watched their commander perform actions that seemed impossible, had seen him function effectively under conditions that should have resulted in immediate death, had participated in combat that transcended their understanding of what individuals could accomplish. Some of them regarded him with awe. Others with a kind of fearful respect. All of them with the recognition that they had served under someone who was fundamentally different from other soldiers they had known. The official reports that would be filed during the following weeks would describe Audie's actions in terms of heroism, courage, and devotion to duty. The recommendations for decoration would emphasize his tactical skill, his leadership under pressure, his willingness to sacrifice personal safety for mission accomplishment. What those reports couldn't capture was the internal cost of what he had done, the psychological price of functioning as a human weapon system under conditions that violated every normal response to mortal danger. When the adrenaline faded and immediate tactical concerns were resolved, Audie found himself dealing with reactions he didn't understand and couldn't control. His hands shook uncontrollably for hours after the fighting ended. His hearing was damaged by prolonged exposure to weapons fire at close range. His sleep was interrupted by dreams that seemed more vivid than waking reality. More disturbing was his emotional response to what had happened. He felt no satisfaction at having accomplished something extraordinary. No pride in having saved lives through his actions. No sense of achievement at having influenced the course of a battle through individual excellence. Instead, he felt empty. Drained not just physically but spiritually, as if something essential about his humanity had been expended during those hours on the burning tank destroyer. the Medal of Honor recommendation was processed with unusual speed. Higher headquarters recognized that they were dealing with combat performance of historical significance, actions that would serve as examples for future generations of American soldiers, but recognition brought responsibilities Audi hadn't anticipated. Interviews with war correspondents. Requests for detailed accounts of his actions. Pressure to serve as a spokesman for American military excellence and individual heroism. He discovered that becoming a legend was more complicated than simply performing legendary actions. Legends belonged not to the individuals who created them, but to the societies that needed them for purposes beyond the original events. His superiors began treating him differently. Not with disrespect, but with the kind of careful deference typically reserved for individuals whose capabilities couldn't be easily categorized. They recognized that they were dealing with someone whose combat abilities transcended normal military categories. Fellow soldiers also treated him differently. Some sought his advice on tactical problems. Others avoided him entirely, made uncomfortable by proximity to someone who had demonstrated abilities that seemed almost supernatural. Most disturbing was his own growing recognition that combat had become the only environment where he felt completely alive, where his abilities had meaning and purpose, where the world made the kind of clear, brutal sense that allowed decisive action. Peacetime interactions felt artificial, complicated by social conventions that seemed meaningless after months of dealing with life-and-death situations. Conversations about topics other than immediate survival felt like elaborate games played by people who had never experienced real stakes. The war was ending. Allied forces were advancing toward Germany on multiple fronts. Enemy resistance, though still determined, was becoming increasingly desperate and disorganized. Military planners were beginning to consider post-war occupation duties and demobilization procedures. For most soldiers, the approaching end of combat operations represented return to normal life, reunion with families, resumption of civilian careers that had been interrupted by military service. For Audie Murphy, the approaching peace represented something far more complex and troubling. He was discovering that he had become someone whose primary value to society was as a weapon, whose most developed skills were related to killing other human beings, whose deepest sense of purpose came from situations that most people would consider nightmarish. The quiet farm boy from Texas had been transformed into America's most decorated soldier, but that transformation had cost him something he was only beginning to understand: the ability to exist comfortably in a world where people weren't trying to kill each other. The war ended for Audie Murphy on May 8, 1945, but he wouldn't return to civilian life for another 18 months. The Army had plans for their most decorated soldier that extended well beyond simple demobilization. War bond tours. Public appearances. Ceremonial duties that would utilize his growing reputation for purposes that had nothing to do with combat effectiveness, but the man they wanted to showcase was struggling with internal battles that made his wartime experiences seem straightforward by comparison. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place at the Pentagon in August 1945, attended by senior military officials, war correspondents, and political figures who understood the propaganda value of American heroism. Audie stood at attention while the nation's highest decoration for valor was placed around his neck, listening to official descriptions of his actions that sounded like they were describing someone else entirely. The citation spoke of conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It described his tactical decisions in clinical terms that emphasized courage, leadership, and devotion to mission accomplishment. What it didn't describe was the internal experience of someone who had discovered capabilities within himself that he didn't understand and wasn't sure he wanted to possess. The public appearances that followed were torture for someone who had never sought attention or recognition. Radio interviews where he was expected to describe combat experiences in terms that would inspire civilian audiences. Newspaper articles that portrayed him as the embodiment of American military virtues. Everyone wanted to know how it felt to be a hero. How he had found the courage to perform actions that seemed impossible. What motivated him during those crucial moments when individual decisions determined tactical outcomes. Audie's standard response became a quiet deflection that revealed nothing about his internal experience. "I was just doing my job." Any soldier would have done the same thing under those circumstances. But privately, he was dealing with questions that had no easy answers. Why had he been able to function effectively under conditions that incapacitated other soldiers? What did his combat abilities reveal about his fundamental character? Most troubling, what kind of person was he becoming, and what did that mean for his future? The nightmares began during his return voyage to the United States. Not dramatic, screaming affairs that would have attracted medical attention, but quiet, persistent dreams that revisited specific moments from his combat experience with perfect clarity. The face of the first German soldier he had killed. The sound wounded men made when they couldn't call for help. The smell of burning vehicles and human flesh. The weight of tactical decisions that resulted in other people's deaths. These memories weren't traumatic in ways that interfered with his daily functioning. They were simply present, like background noise that colored every other experience, reminding him constantly of what he had done and what he had become. The transition to civilian life was supposed to be gradual, supported by programs designed to help veterans readjust to peacetime society. Counseling services. Educational benefits. Job placement assistance. Recognition that men who had spent years in combat might need time and support to resume normal lives, but those programs were designed for typical soldiers, not for individuals whose combat experiences had been so far beyond normal that they constituted a kind of psychological transformation. Audie found himself dealing with readjustment challenges that existing support systems couldn't address. The primary problem was that civilian life felt artificial, meaningless, populated by people who were concerned about things that seemed trivial compared to life and death situations he had navigated for 2 years. Work was particularly difficult. Jobs that other veterans found satisfying seemed to him like elaborate games with arbitrary rules and insignificant consequences. Supervisors who had never experienced combat making decisions about situations that required no real expertise. Co-workers who complained about problems that wouldn't have registered as inconveniences during wartime. More troubling was his growing recognition that he missed combat. Not the death and suffering, not the constant fear and exhaustion, but the clarity of purpose that came from situations where individual competence had immediate, measurable consequences. In combat, his abilities had meaning. His decisions mattered. His skills could determine whether people lived or died. Civilian employment offered no equivalent sense of purpose or significance. Relationships were equally challenging. Friends from before the war found him changed in ways they couldn't understand or accommodate. Family members who wanted to resume previous relationships discovered that the quiet farm boy who had left Texas had been replaced by someone whose experiences they couldn't share or comprehend. Women who were attracted to his reputation as a war hero discovered that the man behind the legend was complex, distant, and marked by experiences he couldn't or wouldn't discuss. The person he had become through combat was fundamentally different from the person civilian society expected him to be. But he had no clear understanding of how to reconcile those differences, or whether reconciliation was even possible. Hollywood offered an escape of sorts. His story attracted attention from film studios that recognized the commercial potential of authentic American heroism. Acting provided an outlet for aspects of his personality that had no other civilian applications, but even entertainment success created new problems. Public appearances that required him to discuss combat experiences he preferred to forget. Interview questions about heroism and courage that forced him to analyze decisions he had made instinctively under extreme pressure. Most difficult was the growing recognition that his public reputation was based on the worst day of his life, the day when everything he had learned about himself and warfare had been tested beyond normal human limits. January 26, 1945, had demonstrated that he possessed capabilities that transcended ordinary military training. But those same capabilities had cost him something essential about his relationship to normal human experience. The quiet moments when he could have talked about these internal struggles never seemed to come. People wanted to hear about heroism, not about the psychological price of heroic actions. They wanted inspiration, not insight into the costs of individual excellence under impossible circumstances. Audie Murphy learned to keep silent about the things that mattered most, to present a public face that met societal expectations while dealing privately with consequences that no one else could understand. The silence became his primary method of self-protection. Not dramatic refusal to discuss his experiences, but quiet deflection that avoided topics that might reveal the internal complexity of what he had become, and in that silence, he carried the weight of a day in France that had transformed him from a human being into something approaching a weapon, and the growing understanding that some transformations couldn't be reversed. Years passed, but January 26, 1945, remained as vivid in Audie Murphy's memory as if it had happened the day before. Not as a collection of heroic moments suitable for public commemoration, but as a series of specific sensations, decisions, and consequences that had shaped everything that followed: the smell of burning fuel from the tank destroyer, the weight of the machine gun he had operated for over an hour, the faces of German soldiers who had fallen under his fire, the sound his own men made when they were hit by enemy bullets. These details weren't traumatic memories in the clinical sense. They were simply present, woven into the fabric of his daily experience, coloring every interaction with civilian life that seemed somehow less real than those hours when survival had depended on split-second tactical decisions. His post-war success in Hollywood provided financial security and public recognition, but it also created obligations that kept him connected to experiences he might have preferred to leave behind. War films that required him to relive combat situations. Interviews that forced him to analyze actions he had performed instinctively under extreme pressure. The public wanted to understand heroism, but heroism was just a word people used to describe actions that couldn't be understood by individuals who hadn't faced similar circumstances. What they really wanted was reassurance that extraordinary individual performance was possible, that Americans possessed qualities that enabled them to triumph over overwhelming odds, that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. Audie provided that reassurance through his public appearances, his film career, and his willingness to serve as a symbol of American military excellence. But privately, he understood that what had happened in France had less to do with heroism than with the kind of tactical situation that revealed capabilities individuals didn't know they possessed. He had discovered that he could function as a weapon system under conditions that would incapacitate most human beings. But that discovery had come with costs that no one else seemed to recognize or understand. The nightmares never stopped entirely. They evolved, becoming less frequent but more specific, focusing on particular moments when his decisions had resulted in other people's deaths. Not just enemy soldiers, but his own men who had been killed or wounded while following his orders. Sleep became something to be managed rather than enjoyed. He developed routines that minimized the likelihood of dreams, staying awake until exhaustion forced unconsciousness, sleeping in positions that prevented deep sleep, maintaining schedules that disrupted normal sleep patterns. These techniques worked well enough to maintain his public functionality, but they also reinforced his growing isolation from normal human experience. Relationships remained difficult. Marriage brought new challenges, as spouses discovered that the men they had married carried internal burdens that affected every aspect of their shared life. Not dramatic psychological problems that could be addressed through medical intervention, but a fundamental alteration in his relationship to civilian existence. He couldn't explain why social events felt artificial, why civilian problems seemed trivial, why he felt most alive during situations that reminded him of combat conditions. These weren't complaints or symptoms that could be addressed through conventional therapy. They were simply the natural consequences of having been transformed by experiences that had no civilian equivalent. Business ventures provided some distraction, but even success in civilian enterprises felt hollow compared to the kind of immediate, life-and-death significance that had characterized his military service. Making money, achieving recognition, building relationships, these activities had their own rewards, but they lacked the existential weight that made individual performance truly matter. The growing recognition that he would never again experience the kind of clarity and purpose that had defined his combat service was more disturbing than any specific traumatic memory. He had become someone whose most developed capabilities were related to warfare, whose deepest sense of meaning came from situations that most people would consider nightmarish, whose psychological architecture had been shaped by experiences that had no peacetime application. As decades passed, the historical significance of his combat record became clearer. Military historians studying the European campaign recognized that his actions had influenced tactical outcomes in ways that extended well beyond the immediate results of individual battles. His example had inspired other soldiers to perform beyond their apparent capabilities. His tactical innovations had been incorporated into military doctrine. Most importantly, His demonstration that individual excellence could determine outcomes under extreme circumstances had become part of American military culture, but historical significance provided no relief from the internal consequences of what he had accomplished, no resolution for the psychological costs of having functioned as a human weapon system under impossible conditions. The silence that had protected him during the immediate post-war years became a permanent aspect of his personality. Not because he was unable to discuss his experiences, but because accurate discussion would have revealed things about warfare, about human capability under extreme stress, and about the costs of individual excellence that civilian society preferred not to understand. People wanted heroes, not insight into what heroic actions cost the individuals who performed them. They wanted inspiration, not analysis of how combat effectiveness was developed and maintained. They wanted reassurance about American military superiority, not understanding of what superior performance required from the human beings who delivered it. SEO-optimized learned to be what his society needed him to be, a symbol of American military excellence whose personal experiences remained private, whose internal struggles were managed quietly, whose silence protected both himself and his public from truths that neither was prepared to confront. The farm boy from Texas who had dreamed of escaping the limitations of small-town life had achieved everything he had imagined and more. Fame, fortune, recognition, historical significance. But he had also discovered that some kinds of success came with prices that couldn't be calculated in advance. January 26, 1945, had made him America's most decorated soldier, but it had also made him someone who would spend the rest of his life carrying the weight of what he had done when everything depended on his ability to function beyond normal human limitations. In his later years, when the immediate pressures of public life had diminished and he could reflect more honestly on what his experiences had meant, Audie Murphy began to understand something about himself and warfare that he had never been able to articulate clearly. The day that made him famous had also been the day he learned the most fundamental truth about human nature, that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary things under circumstances that demanded extraordinary responses, but that such capability came with costs that society preferred not to acknowledge. He had not been born a hero. He had not possessed natural advantages that explained his combat effectiveness. He had not been motivated by patriotic fervor or desire for recognition. He had simply been someone who discovered, under extreme pressure, that he could function as a highly effective weapon system when other people's lives depended on his performance. That discovery had shaped everything that followed: his military career, his transition to civilian life, his relationships, his internal experience of what it meant to be human in a world where most people never faced truly life and death situations. The capabilities he had developed through combat weren't skills that could be turned off when they were no longer needed. They had become part of his fundamental psychological architecture, permanent alterations in how he processed information, made decisions, and related to other people. The silence he had maintained about these internal realities hadn't been motivated by modesty or desire for privacy. It had been a form of protection, for himself and for others who couldn't understand what combat effectiveness actually required from the human beings who achieved it. Society needed heroes, but it didn't need to understand what heroic actions cost the individuals who performed them. People wanted reassurance that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle, but they didn't want insight into what courage and determination actually felt like under impossible circumstances. Most importantly, they didn't want to confront the possibility that their own comfortable civilian existence depended on the willingness of individuals like Audie Murphy to bear psychological burdens that enabled societies to survive existential threats. The farm boy who had picked cotton in Texas heat and dreamed of something beyond small-town limitations had achieved more than he had ever imagined possible. But he had also learned that some achievements came with prices that couldn't be calculated in advance, costs that continued accumulating long after the original events had ended. His combat record had become part of American military history, studied by generations of officers and enlisted personnel who wanted to understand how individual excellence could influence tactical outcomes under extreme circumstances. But the human being who had created that record remained largely unknown, protected by silence that had become his most developed survival skill. The greatest irony of his life was that his most significant public achievement, the actions that made him famous, that earned him the nation's highest decorations, that established his historical reputation, represented experiences he would have given anything to forget. January 26, 1945, had demonstrated that he possessed capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. But it had also demonstrated that such capabilities came with psychological costs that lasted long after the immediate tactical situation had been resolved. The weight of that day, not just what he had accomplished, but what accomplishing it had required from him internally, was something he carried alone, something that civilian society could celebrate but couldn't share or fully understand. In the end, that may have been the most profound aspect of his service, not just his willingness to risk his life in combat, but his willingness to carry alone the internal consequences of what effective combat performance demanded from human beings. The quiet farm boy from Texas had become America's most decorated soldier by discovering that he could function beyond apparent human limitations when survival depended on such performance. But he had also discovered that functioning beyond human limitations changed someone in ways that civilian life couldn't accommodate or reverse, and perhaps that discovery, more than any specific combat action, represented his deepest contribution to understanding what military service actually cost the individuals who provided it, and what societies owed to those who bore such costs on behalf of others who would never be required to understand what such service actually meant. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, remember that heroism often looks different from the inside than it does from the outside. The quiet courage of carrying internal burdens without complaint, the strength required to function in civilian society when your deepest experiences can't be shared or understood, the dignity of silence when truth would be too heavy for others to bear. Rest easy, knowing that sometimes the greatest service is invisible, that some victories are won in silence, and that the most profound courage is often the kind that goes unrecognized by the world, but sustains the world nonetheless. Sleep well. Thank you for joining me for this quiet exploration of what it meant to be Audie Murphy, not just the decorated soldier, but the human being who carried the weight of extraordinary experiences with characteristic Texas dignity and silence. Sweet dreams.